The question is, what is biblical worship? And in my personal experience, I've gone through different stages, different attitudes about what really constituted biblical worship. As was mentioned, I grew up in a Dutch Calvinist home. People sometimes ask, what's Dutch Calvinism? It's kind of like Presbyterianism, only everybody's Dutch. So think Presbyterians with wooden shoes and windmills, and there you go, okay? It's kind of how I was raised, a kind of tradition. Let's get back into Scripture, and let's start at the beginning and work our way forward and just look at what Scripture says about worship. What is the biblical background for worship? Okay, I should have put a little blank for this, but the Hebrew word for worship is a fun one to say. It's hishtachavah. Okay? Hishtachavah. Let's see if you can say that with me. Ready? Hishtachavah. Okay? And it's chava. You got to scrape the back of your throat there, like ich or bach. Okay? You got to do that. It's hishtachavah. I'll spell it for you. Hishtachavah. Hishtachavah. We don't say hishtachavah, but you do the scrape in the back of your throat. Hishtachavah. That's one way of transliterating it into English characters. And this word has two meanings. Sometimes it just means bow down. It's just a synonym for bow down. And other times it's got a fuller sense, what we would translate as worship. And it's very interesting. You go into the Old Testament and you look for the first occurrence of this word when it's not just a synonym for bow down. Okay? So a couple of references early on in Genesis where it just means bow down, but then the first time it means worship in the full sense is actually in a very significant passage of Scripture. This is Genesis 22. We read here, "Then Abraham said to his young men, 'Stay here with the ass. I and the lad will go yonder and worship and come again to you.'" Now, some of you know what this passage is all about, Genesis 22, one of the most significant chapters in the Bible that every Christian should have, as it were, engraved on your heart, Genesis 22. Genesis 22 is what Jews call the Akedah, A-Q-E-D-A-H, Akedah. So you got to get your money's worth out of this conference. If you go back home to your parish, you don't know any fancy words, Where did you go to that conference for? We learned about hishtachavah at the Akedah. Whoa. Yes, across the big Grey Poupon, thank you. So anyway, it's the Akedah. The Akedah means binding, okay, the binding of Isaac. This is the passage where Isaac is bound. We know the story. God commands Abraham to go to a mountain which the Lord will show him. And at that mountain, Abraham was supposed to take his only begotten son, Isaac, up onto the mountaintop and there sacrifice him to the Lord. And so Abraham obeys this, and he takes his young men with him, and they travel 3 days to this mountain. It's later identified as Mount Moriah, where the temple would later be built by Solomon. And they leave the young men at the base of the mountain, and Abraham and Isaac walk together up the mountain. And Isaac is carrying the wood of the sacrifice on his back, as Abraham carries the fire and the knife. And of course, as they're walking up, Isaac noticed something. Oh, we're going to do a sacrifice. Where's the lamb? Dad, we forgot the lamb. Dad, I got a question. What's going on here? Okay, we got the fire. We really forgot something important here, And then Abraham responds to Isaac's question, a very significant phrase. He says, "My son, the Lord will provide himself a lamb for the offering. That's what it says in Genesis 22, Abraham's word. The Lord will provide himself a lamb for the offering. A powerful phrase, very good translation of it in the RSV CE. This is a second edition, a translation of the Bible I recommend that you have. The Lord will provide himself a lamb, because that translation in the English gets almost exactly the ambiguity of the Hebrew and the Greek as well. Okay, in both the Hebrew and the Greek, this passage in the Old Testament has two senses. The Lord will provide himself a lamb. It could mean either God himself is going to go out and get a lamb for us for the sacrifice at the top of the mountain, or God will provide himself as a lamb for the sacrifice. And both senses are true. One sense is going to be fulfilled in Genesis 22. The secondary sense is going to wait for a fuller fulfillment about 2,000 or more years later. Okay? So anyway, Abraham and Isaac go up to the top of the mountain. Notice in this passage in Genesis 22, Isaac is the one who carries the wood, which indicates he's the stronger of the two, which indicates he's reached young manhood. You know, we think, sometimes you see pictures of this event, and, Isaac's this little 5-year-old, he's strapped up, strapped down the altar, and Abraham's here with a big knife. Like, oh, that's so awful, he's going to kill this little kid. No, Isaac is a teenager by now, stronger than his father. He's the one who carries the wood. The logical conclusion to be drawn from that is, if Isaac wanted to overpower his father or simply flee, he could have. And so it's unanimous in the Jewish tradition, in the rabbinic tradition, that Isaac was a willing participant in this event. It was a death he freely accepted. Okay. Ever heard those words before? Yeah, okay. So the meaning, what is the meaning of this event? Well, we have the Father offering his only begotten Son on the wood on the top of this mountain. We know what's going on here. John 3:16, for God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son. The Apostle John uses a word there in John 3:16. He uses a word that's used 3 times in Genesis 22. Okay? In the Hebrew, it's the word yahid, means the one and only. And outside of Genesis 22, this word is extremely rare in the rest of the Old Testament. So when John says, God so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son, or his only begotten Son, when he uses that phrase, only begotten, he is clearly alluding to Genesis 22 and picking up the image of Isaac and saying, Jesus is like a new Isaac, okay, who is willingly accepting a sacrifice at the top of a mountain. Okay, so what is going on in Genesis 22? Genesis 22 is the Calvary of the Old Testament. It is the most striking icon of the event that will lead to the salvation of the whole human race that is to come through Christ on Calvary. Calvary was not even very far physically from the site of Mount Moriah in Genesis 22, Mount Moriah being the place where the temple would later be built. In the rabbinic tradition, they were well aware of the fact that the temple was built on the site on which Isaac had nearly been offered on the mount. And the rabbis asked themselves a question, where do the animal sacrifices that we offer in the temple, where do they get their effectiveness, their efficacy? Okay. Because there's passages in the Old Testament itself that say that animals don't take away sin, that the blood of animals is not what God really wants. So in the rabbinic tradition, they ask, well, if we got these passages in the Psalms that say that, animal sacrifices are not, the ultimate, not the ultimate answer, then what is the meaning of these sacrifices that we offer in the temple? And you know what the conclusion that the rabbis came to? They said, you know what? These animal sacrifices in the temple are offered in the same place where Isaac once freely accepted a potential death, okay, in offering himself to God. What these animal sacrifices then are representations of that one efficacious, freely accepted sacrifice of our ancestor when he gave himself freely, okay, on the mountaintop. And all these, they just kind of draw their power from that one event. What does that sound like? Okay. Sounds like Eucharistic theology, doesn't it? Okay, the one sacrifice.